Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the LandPRO post-conference educational webinar. Today we have three great informational sessions by Zeifmans, our platinum sponsor, Diverso Energy, and Torkin Mains. This session is also being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube so everybody can review it, and we'll also be sharing that once that's done. At the end of everybody's session, there is going to be time for Q&A. So while the presentation is going on, if any questions are happening, please type them in the chat, and then the presenter will be able to go through them once the presentation is done and answer all questions that you may have. So today, Zeifmans is going to be going over current tax considerations for the real estate sector. Diverso will be going into harnessing geothermal for CMHC financing, a short-term solution with long-term gains. And Torkin Mains will be discussing upcoming amendments to the Construction Act. So our first presentation is going to be through Zeifmans. So I am going to now just give Ahmad the host rights so that he may start his presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. Many thanks, Jessica, and congratulations once again for putting together an amazing event. LandPRO Conference has become a must-attend event for land professionals, condo professionals, real estate, and development industry professionals. During these uncertain times, it was really helpful to understand and learn from the industry leaders. I'm sure, like me, all of you enjoyed this event and gained from the excellent insight provided by the various speakers. I had the pleasure of meeting some of you, and hopefully for the rest of you, we can meet at the next year 2026 LandPRO. With that, I'll dive into our presentation. I would like to just touch upon some of the recent changes affecting real estate sector from the tax standpoint. Some of these agenda items you might be familiar with, some of these might be new. So I would like to cover as much as I can during this brief time, but if you have any question online, offline, I'm happy to answer those. Okay, so with that introduction, let me just quickly share a few things about Zeifmans. We are a mid-service accounting firm. We provide all of the traditional services you would expect from a full-service accounting firm: accounting, tax, consulting. We've been around since 1959. We are about 18 partners, over 100, and I think well over 175 individuals. With my last count, I think we were around 200 people in our Toronto office. We also have a remote team, and with a combined experience of hundreds of years of our partners and professionals, we are happy to service you with all of your accounting and tax needs. We are very entrepreneurial in nature. Due to our long history, we have been servicing some clients over multiple generations, and that speaks to the quality of service we provide and the loyalty of our clients. In terms of the very high level numbers, we are one of the top 20 accounting firms in Canada. As I mentioned, it's around 200 people, about 13,000 clients, servicing every step of their business life cycle. With that, let's just dive right into the topics. The first topic I want to cover is the changes to capital gain taxation. These changes, I'm sure you've seen a lot of back and forth. We, as professionals in helping our clients dealing with these changes, it's been a confusing time. Just as a background, the original proposal was in 2024 budget, but somehow it was not in the budget. It was in the supplementary documents, and during all of the 2024 transition, that supplementary proposal was not actually passed and did not become law. So at the start of the year, CRA usually has a policy that any formal proposal provided by the government is treated as if it's enacted. And as such, the CRA has started the administration as if that proposal was enacted when we started the year, January 2025. So let's just recap what the proposal was. The government had proposed to increase the capital gain inclusion rate from the current 50% level to 66.67, or 2/3 of the capital gain would be taxable. They did provide an exception for individuals for the first 250,000 of that gain would remain under 50% inclusion rate. Anything above 250,000 would be considered 66.67% inclusion. For the corporations realizing any capital gain, there was no such exception. Every dollar of capital gain was to be taxed at 2/3 of inclusion rate as opposed to 50%. With the effective date originally from June 25th, 2024, we and a lot of other tax professionals scrambled to help our clients navigate these changes and lessen the impact of those. But during early 2025, the government basically said that they're going to delay the implementation of that proposal to January 2026. So even though it originally was proposed to be effective 2024, now the proposal has been delayed to January 2026. And then again, during the election campaign, we are watching the election unfold in the next three to 4 weeks. We're going to have a new government. Both leading parties have already committed to not enact this proposal. So effectively, the good news is that with all of that confusion caused by various back and forth, effectively this proposal is dead now. So we can take a sigh of relief and not worry about this additional tax burden on any capital gains realized on sale of properties. So with that bit of good news, let's get into the second topic for today, and that's the enhanced GST rebate for purpose-built rental housing. It's no secret we are going through a housing crisis, and all of the party leaders have launched various proposals to deal with it. The last government did enact some changes to the existing rules to incentivize new availability of new housing. And the purpose-built rental housing was one of the areas where some of the proposals were directed at. This proposal to increase the GST rebate for purpose-built rental housing was one of that package the government announced. So effectively what it does is that currently, if you recall, there is up to 36% of GST which you can recover for rental units. And then there is a cap of up to 450,000 of fair value limitation per unit, which, as you can appreciate in GTA, is a very, very low number. So what this change does is it essentially increased the rebate to full 100%. And the cap has been removed as well. But there are some conditions attached. The definition of the residential unit subject to this proposal is at least 4 residential unit, self-contained residential unit containing kitchen and the rest of the living area and full facilities, or 10 private rooms available in that property. And at least 90% of the residential units in that property must be for the long-term residential rental. So effectively, these are apartment blocks which are covered under these proposals. Some smaller construction, as you can appreciate, as long as it has more than 4 residential units are eligible. What's not covered is single unit housing, duplexes, triplexes, or renovation to the existing rental properties. The construction must begin after September 13, 2023, and before 2031, with substantial completion must happen prior to 2036. So there is significant time available. I know the times are uncertain these days. We are second guessing what's going to happen next day. But this proposal, I think, is a fairly substantive proposal at taking a stab at the housing crisis. And then attached to this proposal was this enhanced capital cost allowance. As a recap, if you appreciate the current capital cost allowance or the amount you can write off in terms of your capital investment in a residential rental property is capped at 4% currently. This proposal allows a temporary increase from 4% to 10%. And most of the eligibility criteria is essentially the same as the enhanced GST rebate proposal, that the unit must be, the property must have at least 4 self-contained units or more than 10 private rooms, and the building period has to be before December 31st, 2030, with substantial completion by January 1st, 2036. So both of these proposals are aimed at increasing the supply of purpose-built rental housing. With that, I'm going to also talk about some of the other changes, which are not necessarily incentives, but changes which affect your ability to comply with the existing rules. Underused Housing Act was launched in 2022, and there were a lot of gray areas when the government launched that. It was not properly thought out process, and unintended consequences of that were that a lot of people got caught by those rules, which were not supposed to be under the original purpose of that legislation, that we want to increase the supply of available units in the market. So government enacted a Bill C-69 in 2024, which provided a little bit more clarity, broadened the definition of who is subject to Underused Housing Act, and increase the scope of what we call the excluded owners, the owners who are not subject to this legislation, who are not supposed to comply with the filing requirements. That definition is now broad enough to essentially cover most of the Canadians, either directly or indirectly owning through Canadian-owned private corporation or owning directly. Generally now, what's covered through this legislation, or people who are subject to this legislation and the filing requirements, are non-resident, non-Canadian owners of vacant and underused housing. The majority of Canadian owners are exempted by it. The other improvement in this bill was with respect to condominium rental arrangements, where initially it was every single unit was subject to the filing requirement. The new bill essentially looks at the whole building as one unit, and that lessens the paperwork which owners have to manage to comply with the requirement of Underused Housing Act. The other proposal aimed at increasing the supply of housing units is the Apartment Construction Loan Program. This program is aimed at providing low-cost loans to support the development of rental housing. The program offers loan ranging from minimum of $1 million up to 100% of the cost of residential component of a project. There are 3 different streams. The program aims to target the funding at. The first one is the standard rental housing unit. As it's a low-cost loan to support the development of the standard housing units. Senior rental housing units is also part of this, the scope of this incentive, and targeted financing for projects that offer accommodation and access to services for seniors or living independently. And lastly, the program is also aimed at increasing the supply of student housing, designed to support the development of the student housing units on campus or close to post-secondary educational institutions. And the next, so these were the proposals which I just shared with you. They're mostly aimed at the builders. Now, some of the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the incentives which are available for the actual users, consumers, so the buyers of these units. So first one, which is a tax-free home saving account. We are all familiar with tax-free saving account. Tax-free home saving account in some ways is a better constructed program, but in other ways, it's a little bit more restrictive in terms of its availability and applicability. So let's get into it. What this tax-free first home saving account does is it allows Canadians to contribute up to $8,000 per year, with a maximum lifetime limit of $40,000 towards their first down payment of their first home. Unlike the tax-free saving accounts, where contributions are not deductible, contributions to first home saving accounts are deductible. And similar to the first TFSA, where the withdrawals are exempt from income, contributions for first home saving accounts when they are taken out, as long as they are taken out for the eligible purpose, which is to buy your first house, are not taxable either. So when you contribute, you get a tax deduction. When you take it out to buy your first house, there is no income inclusion. If you recall, we have a similar incentive through RSP under home buyer plan, which allows you to under the new enhanced limit of up to $60,000 of withdrawal, but that amount has to be paid back over the next 15 years into your RSP plan. The first home saving account need not to be put back into the account once you have contributed and you're taking the money out to buy the house. That amount is not to be put back into the plan. So from that perspective, it's an improvement from the both home buyer plan and the tax-free saving account. And similar to tax-free saving account, any contributions grow tax-free within the plan. The eligibility is fairly simple. Any Canadian having attained the age of majority in the jurisdiction they are living in, usually 18 years in Ontario, can open an account. Once you have opened an account, you are now getting that annual $8,000 contribution limit. So even if you don't intend to contribute in the first year, it helps to open that account so that you have that annual contribution limit accumulated in that plan. And the next year is the first year you open the account and you didn't put any money in, and next year you next year you put the contribution in. Now your limit is $16,000. The maximum limit remains the same; it's $14,000, but the contribution room does add up over the life of the plan. The other incentive aimed at the purchaser of the housing units is the new 30-year amortization period allowed, effective December 15, 2024, for all first-time home buyers or buyers of a new construction purchase are eligible for a 30-year mortgage amortization. The maximum purchase price for the insured mortgages has also been increased from $1 million to $1.5 million. And the amortization period, as I said previously, for insured mortgages was 25 years, now is 30 years. So that should also help with the payment, monthly payment applicable to those mortgages. Mind you that there is an impact on the total interest paid over the life of the plan. If you extend the amortization period, the amount of interest you're going to pay over the period of 30 years is going to be significantly more than what you would have paid under 25-year amortization, because the money is now outstanding for a longer period of time. Lastly, there are some other measures which are more punitive in nature. One of that is the residential property flipping rules. Let's talk about those in detail. The program is aimed at the disposition of residential property where the owner owns that property for less than a year. As a background, if you recall, a taxpayer, when you sell a residential property, depending on the situation, the gain is either treated fully taxable capital gain, business income, or if it qualifies for principal residence exemption, it's not taxable at all. What this proposal essentially does is that as long as the property is flipped or sold within first year of the ownership, all of that goes out the window. The gain is taxable and taxable at the full business income rate, not capital gain rate, which means 100% inclusion in your income. On the flip side of it, if the market is not doing well and you end up selling that house at a loss within the first 365 days of ownership, that loss is not deductible. And as I said, the original concept that what your intention was, are you professional, are you just one-time transaction, and is it business income, is capital gain, is it exempt, all of that is out the window. As long as you are selling it within first year of ownership, you are subject to these rules. And more importantly, the assignment sales are also subject to these rules. So there is no exemption for assignment sales, even if you have not taken the ownership and if you just sold your right to a under construction unit. that gain would also be considered full business income, and you must report that in your tax return. There are some penalties as well involved with respect to non-compliance with the program. As always, non-compliance is never a good idea. So be aware of these rules when you make those decisions with respect to any residential sale of residential units. And then I want to also talk about this prohibition on purchase of residential property by non-Canadian. This was a very blanket kind of prohibition, effectively saying that within census metropolitan areas or areas called census agglomeration areas, which effectively they are defined as CMAs are areas where at least 100,000 people live, with 50,000 or more living in the core. And the CAs are the areas which have a population of at least 10,000. So it basically covers most of the GTA or all of the GTA or Greater Toronto and Hamilton area as well. And any significant community would be caught by this. So non-Canadians are prohibited to buy residential units in those areas. Originally, rules were enacted effective January 1st, 2023. And they were supposed to be in place for 2 years. During last year, government extended these prohibition to January 2027. It only applies to residential units which are defined as a property unit as a building with 3 or less units. It does not prohibit foreign buyers to invest in larger rental or residential properties. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my conversation. I hope I'm not over too much of my time allocation, but I'm open to any questions you have at this point.
Thank you. So yeah, we have 2 there in chat. So the first one is owned for 365 days, starting from ownership or occupancy?
From occupancy. So the ownership is, let me just step back. So in most cases, once the deed is transferred, once you own the unit, that is the time the clock starts. If you own the unit and now you are doing some renovations and stuff, that's within that period. So the clock is ticking as soon as you own that unit.
Okay, great. And then what about land?
So if you recall, the aim was residential units. So land, if it's a plain vanilla land, that would not be caught by the definition of that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, so now we are going on to Diverso. So we're going to be discussing harnessing geothermal for CMHC financing, a short-term solution for long-term gains. Tim, you're now a host, so you're able to share your screen.
All right, thank you. So by way of introduction, my name is Tim Weber, and I'm one of the co-founders at Diverso Energy. We are a turnkey geothermal provider offering both design build solutions as well as our energy as a service utility model, where we design, build, own, and operate the geothermal, similar to any other conventional utility, natural gas or electricity. And joining me today is longtime friend and colleague Mercedes Byers, who's principal and co-founder of Prattis Group. And Mercedes has been in the industry for 15 years, and they focus primarily on sustainability consulting, whether it be CMHC, TGS, LEED, and they're there to kind of navigate those very complicated waters as they are now for clients, to help them find the best solution. Also, that solution that works within the financial parameters, which are, more constrained now than they've ever been, which kind of requires this complicated matrix of solutions to get to that preferred end result. So today we want to talk a little bit about CMHC, as well as how geothermal as a technology aligns with CMHC and where it does make sense, and maybe with sometimes where it makes less sense, and just trying to, you know, debunk some of those myths and misconceptions, but also address some of the both challenges and opportunities that geothermal may present. So I think, you know, no surprise to anyone on the call today, the industry has shifted. It's shifted for a lot of reasons. You know, condos are virtually non-existent. We're still seeing some clients in kind of the tertiary markets where mid-rise condos are still selling, albeit very slowly. I think the high-rise Toronto condos are, you know, put on hold indefinitely right now, and a lot of these projects are shifting from condo to rental. And that's, you know, less of a challenge for some developers who do both, but for the primary, you know, for the merchant condo developer, that's a big shift. And, you know, trying to figure out how to do that from a financial perspective is very difficult. And at the same time, there's construction costs have gone up, interest rates have gone up, rental rates have gone down. So those pro formas and projects penciling out, they're literally just kind of teetering on that razor thin margin of pass or fail. And we're seeing a lot of projects right now where, you know, they have the land, they have the zoning, they have the site plan approval. So there's this desire and this pressure to move forward. You know, these development firms are machines and they need to keep the wheels turning. So they're moving forward with all the pre-con. However, there's one piece that's still missing, and that's the financing. Obviously, a very key piece to that puzzle. And the challenge is getting the bank on board and making the project pro forma work to get the construction financing required to move it forward. And that's where, you know, they're looking for some type of financial relief, and that's coming in the form of CMHC. And I'd say probably 90% of the developers we're talking to, their comment is, you know, it's not necessarily their preference to work with the CMHC financing, but it's the only way they can get the project to pencil out. It's the longer amortization, lower equity, you know, the higher debt service ratio, lower interest rates, and the MLI Select. And then there's the apartment construction loan program, which you heard about in more detail in the last presentation. But I think what both of these two things have in common is a departure from the norm from a design perspective, whether it be the envelope, the mechanical system, the energy source that's providing heating and cooling. And, you know, that sounds simple enough when you know, look at it high level. However, in an industry who's been doing the same thing for a long time, and I think, you know, the Toronto construction industry and the development industry is an incredibly well-oiled, sophisticated machine, and no different than go into a Ford assembly plant or a Honda or a Toyota. It's an incredibly well-oiled, sophisticated machine, but it's based on copy, paste, repeat. And now all of a sudden to walk into a copy, paste, repeat situation and ask them to kind of depart from that and do something different is incredibly difficult. So it's not that developers, I think, are resistant to change. They're just not, it's an institute that's not set up necessarily to change how they do things. And both of these programs require significant change, a change to design, whether it's envelope or mechanical. So I think, you know, before we get too far into the geothermal, I'm going to hand it over to Mercedes and, you know, get her perspective, because I'm kind of standing from the outside in trying to provide a Tylenol to the headache, whereas Mercedes the one who's trying to navigate, and in some cases she might even be creating that headache on behalf of the client. So
yeah, I think what I would just echo is, to your point, Tim, we're starting to see a huge shift towards projects exploring and seeking you know, enrollment within these particular programs. And within both the MLI Select as well as the ALCP, one of the biggest criteria surrounds energy efficiency. So there are different levels of thresholds that you have to meet, whether it's for MLI Select, which is a points-based system, or ACLP, which is mandatory thresholds. It is tiered, and the higher tiering you achieve, or the maximized number of points you achieve, the more attractive and the higher prioritization your application to CMHC receives. So under both of these programs, as mentioned, kind of the main focus we find in dealing with our clients really is on this conversation of energy efficiency. And to your point, kind of changing the status quo of the way that things were designed previously aren't necessarily how we're moving forward. Specifically, we're looking at major energy use reductions, particularly around space heating and cooling. This is where, I'm sure you'll speak to, but geothermal can have a really big impact. There is opportunity to reduce that load by anywhere from 30 to 50%, because often it's the largest energy load within a building. And these programs, CMHC programs, really, this is a key metric that they kind of require to be considered. On our end, we also do a lot of iterative energy modeling. So we're working with teams kind of in the early stages to assess, baseline, quantify how we're achieving these particular energy efficiency targets. So typically energy modeling wouldn't necessarily happen until, OBC compliance at building permit. So we're starting to see this to be a requirement kind of at the upfront stages of a project. So it's accelerating a bit of the design process to earlier stages of the project, where we're needing to make decisions on certain design measures that maybe would typically happen a little bit later. So I would just caution everybody, or to be aware that you're going to need to start making earlier decisions, and if you want to align or achieve some of the qualifications that are required for both MLI Select as well as ACLP. I think another thing that just really aligns itself nicely from a geothermal perspective is that CMHC does favor electrified and low carbon systems. And this is where, again, geothermal fits in really nicely, because we can entirely eliminate reliance on natural gas for heating. And it also adds an added benefit of aligning your project with potentially the zero carbon building standard, or Passive House, or other kind of third-party international green building rating systems. So you can kind of get a bit of a 2-for-1 there.
Yeah, thanks, Mercedes. And I think, your point about the design, things that maybe design decisions that normally happen later need to be accelerated. So just to elaborate on that, because our involvement is typically through the mechanical engineer, and it's often the mechanical engineer is tasked with, looking at these different technical options that align with what Mercedes and her team is trying to do from an energy modeling, carbon, all of those metrics that are required for this program. And I think it's not like it's certainly not a one size fits all. And this is where it gets complicated. There's different ways of getting to the same place. It's almost like, I love analogies. So one analogy here would maybe be a car manufacturer. If their mandate was, say, 5 liters per 100 kilometers, 4 liters per 100 kilometers, that was the fuel efficiency mandate. There's different ways of getting there. And if you're, as a manufacturer, for some reason, very resistant to electrification, and you're really dogmatic about sticking with the internal combustion motor, you can get there, but it'll mean specialized tires and maybe using different materials for your frame or your body. It's a carbon fiber frame, and now the aerodynamics becomes a big deal, and those aerodynamics compromises the usability and the practicality of the vehicle inside. And then there's all these compromises to get there, and you get to a point where it's like, you know what, why don't we just take the same vehicle, the same that we've always made, and just put an electric motor in it? That might be an easier way of getting there, rather than doing 6 different other things. And I think buildings are very similar. You can get here without geothermal, but it means either triple pane or smaller punched windows. It means, your makeup air now has a heat wheel and your domestic hot water system looks different and thermal brakes on all the belt, all of these, there's 6 or 7 things that kind of get you there. The problem is the cost might be more, the complexity might be more, not always, but what you haven't done is decarbonize. And I think for a lot of our clients, especially more institutional clients who are looking long-term and asset valuation and future proofing, to get there through the envelope is not as appealing as decarbonizing the building and fuel shifting from natural gas to electric. And that could be in the form of geothermal heat pumps or air source heat pumps. That's 2 different versions of the same thing. And that really comes down to building height, building type, and practicality. Some cases it makes more sense to drill holes under the building, out of sight, out of mind. In some cases, it might make more sense to have air source heat pumps on the roof. That's really more from a practical standpoint, but it's both result in decarbonization.
And I would just add to that you're absolutely right. There are many different ways that you can get there in terms of certain thresholds and percent improvements in energy or GHG reductions. But for both MLI Select as well as for ACLP, there are, whether it's a threshold of points or a tiered system, the program is becoming increasingly competitive. As Tim mentioned, almost everybody he's kind of speaking with on the development side is now pursuing these different programs. And I can speak from our end, we probably have 50 or 60 different projects that are all pursuing a program under CMHC. And although geothermal may not be required for, minimum level of points or lower thresholds or tiers, because of the demand within these programs, there is an incentive to ensure that your application is as attractive as possible. And part of what makes it attractive is going above and beyond kind of the minimum thresholds. So I did just want to flag that for everyone on the call as well.
It's interesting. I actually didn't know that. So I think, there's another point to all of this too. It's almost 2 different things happening in parallel. So there's the CMHC, but for a lot of projects, especially if they're in Toronto, and I think soon to be other municipalities that are adopting their own green standards, it's almost, you have to do this anyway. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Mercedes. You're closer to, you're more in the weeds on this than I am, but a lot of the carbon reduction requirements, energy reduction requirements of the CMHC almost parallel what's required for TGS. Close enough that it's kind of like you check one box, you immediately get the other. So in some cases, you kind of have to do this anyway if you're building in Toronto. So it's whether your motivation is CMHC financing or you're mandated through Toronto Green Standard anyway, would you say it's pretty close to the same thing?
Yeah, I would say that, for the kind of entry level tiers of points for MLI Select or, tier 2 or tier 2 essentially for ACLP, yes, that aligns really well with already some of the prescribed requirements of, for instance, TGS. And to your point, Tim, there are a number of other municipal standards that have been recently rolled out. So for instance, the city of Mississauga now has their green development standard. So does the city of Hamilton, and they mimic TGS. And you'll see a lot of consistency around specifically absolute energy performance targets that kind of follow through, trickle down through all of these different standards. And again, yeah, further just regulating that you're at kind of the site plan stage, demonstrating you will achieve specific targets that align themselves very nicely with CMHC.
As frustrating as this might be for some developers, and it's that resistance to change. And I'm as a business owner myself, I'm very sympathetic to that, but kind of taking a higher level viewpoint of this, and this is after 20 years in the geothermal space, I think this is a little bit of forcing someone to eat their vegetables and do some exercise. There's resistance to it, but long term, I think it's a better product. The building's going to be built better. It's going to be more resilient, lower maintenance. I think down the road, 10, 15 years from now, if you had to speculate, obviously can't prove this theory. However, if trends even slightly continue in this direction and you're somebody who's an asset manager, you're going to be glad you're going to want your buildings to be low carbon buildings. There will be a valuation benefit, I think, to low carbon buildings. And then there's also the idea of future policy. You look at New York City, local law 97, that was dropped on the developers 5 years ago. They never saw it coming. And now all of a sudden you've got buildings that are 5 or 6 years old that are somewhat antiquated and have to be retrofitted to comply with this new policy. And I think, a lot of the pension fund institutional REIT clients we have, what keeps them up at night isn't the policy that's in front of them now. It's the one they don't know about yet that they're trying to future proof for.
Yeah.
So by putting in something like geothermal and sizing it in a way that it's doing your heating and cooling, your space conditioning, and a portion of your domestic hot water, if you were to fully electrify that building and cut the gas line, it's actually physically possible. I wouldn't suggest doing it now. I believe, this is just my opinion, that it's maybe diminishing returns in this climate probably doesn't make sense. However, it's your stone's throw away from being able to do that in the future. Whereas if you get to the CMHC or TGS through just envelope improvements and you still have that gas boiler as your core heating source, trying to cut that gas line 10 years from now is almost virtually impossible. You're talking about a major retrofit of a 300 unit occupied building versus just putting an air to water heat pump and a water to water heat pump and a storage tank. And now you've addressed your domestic hot water and you're fully electrified. That's very doable. Yeah, I think we're pretty much, I was just going to quick speak to
Go ahead.
different
Yep.
business models in the industry. So our industry's evolved quite a bit. Some developers prefer to own the system themselves, but we're seeing the more developers understand that geothermal is a living, breathing entity. It's not a piece of equipment, it's energy infrastructure. They recognize that, their talents lie in bricks and mortar, not energy management. And they like the idea of an off-balance sheet kind of energy as a service flow through that they can flow through to tenants, providing that number's, not something that is too high that they choke on. It also eliminates that risk. Now a third party owns it, and just like any utility, it's their responsibility to guarantee the energy supply, and it shifts that risk and accountability from the building owner to the third party energy provider. And I think, I can't stress this enough, geothermal comes up a lot in those pre-con design conversations. It's, some would argue it's kind of becoming table stakes now. It doesn't mean necessarily it's happening in all of the projects, but there's very few projects where it doesn't come up at least as a consideration. And I think the problem is the more popular something becomes, the easier it is to commoditize it and just treat it like a piece of equipment. And geothermal is just as complicated as it always has been. It's energy infrastructure the construction process is very complicated. How it's integrated into the building at the lowest possible cost is complicated. And then how it's managed long-term, because a bore field, contrary to popular belief, we're not pulling energy out of the ground. It's not going into the ground. It's actually a heat sink. So that energy balance is very critical. Air conditioning goes into the ground, it's stored. That heat is extracted in the winter and it's used for heating. The more efficient Mercedes is making these buildings, the more cooling dominant they become, because those efficiencies have more of an impact on heating than cooling. So there's more heat going into the ground that's coming out, and that needs to be managed. And how we manage that is all based on how it's integrated into the building, domestic hot water, preheat, makeup air, all of those things. So as much as geothermal is a wonderful solution and it works well and it's simple and it's pipes in the ground and water and dirt and it's resilient, it's also, there's considerations that need to be made for it. It's also something you're counting on for heating and cooling for the life of the building. So doing it right is incredibly important, because you only get one chance at it. So I think I'll pause there. I think we've done well for time. So
Yeah, so you guys have a bunch of questions here in the chat. The first one is through David. He's trying to understand potential operating cost savings going geothermal versus conventional builds, both if we outright purchase the geothermal install or if we get Diverso to design, build, and operate.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you looked at the fully loaded operational savings, and I hate to say it depends, but it does somewhat kind of depend on what that baseline is. So I'll give you an example. If it's a 30-story building and you're eliminating that cooling tower, the cooling tower alone, there's the operational savings, no longer electricity to run it. Cooling tower like that probably uses about $20,000 to $25,000 a year of water. That's no longer needed. But it's the capital reserve savings that's a big one. The cost of craning a new cooling tower on the roof in 20 or 25 years could be $800,000. It's significant. So when you look at the total operational savings, same with the gas boilers that have been eliminated, there's the maintenance, the repairs, the natural gas plus the replacement. When you add all that up, I'm going to say it's somewhere between a 8 and 10% return on investment. However, and if we own it, it's approximately a break even. So the charge is about the same as the savings. However, the baseline has changed. If you're looking at TGS or CMHC and you have to do something anyway, because that savings is only compared to doing nothing. So if you have to do something, in some cases, geothermal, or in many cases, it's actually the lowest cost option. So there really is no return on investment because there's ROI doesn't exist because there's really no there's no incremental investment to be made. So business as usual is no longer an option, changing the baseline.
How early on in the process is energy modeling required? It does not seem reasonable to model at SPA or earlier.
Yes, I can take that one. So understood that it's not typical to be modeling at SPA for a traditional project. Modeling happened at building permit to submit for OBC SP10 code compliance. That being said, in any jurisdiction that has a green development standard, modeling is required at SPA. And as we previously mentioned, these green municipal standards are now extending well beyond the city of Toronto throughout the GTA. There are others proposed, even in Ottawa, in BC, what have you. The key benefit, and I spoke to this a little bit earlier, is it's that the design process itself is being kind of front loaded, more so than in a traditional sense. These key decisions around how you're meeting these targets and objectives need to be vetted early on to avoid any sort of redesign and loss of time. So both from a budget perspective, but as well as from a scheduling perspective, because what you don't want to see happen is have your project advance to a building permit level and do a model and understand that you're not meeting the CMHC, that you're not meeting, any other particular requirements that the project may need to have. So early stage modeling is really critical to validate that the design is sufficient for whatever the project targets may be.
Awesome, thank you. And then the last two questions we're going to combine just because there's a cost portion of it, which I know is going to be completely relevant to the project, so not really something that we can put a number on, but more, I guess, the concept. So air source heat pumps versus geothermal in terms of costs. And then what is the approximate lifespan of geothermal and what portions of the system would need to be replaced?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So the first one, it's another depends, unfortunately. I think, I'll often have conversations with clients when they talk about their objective and the size of the building. Sometimes I'll actually right out of the gates, I think this is a good candidate for air source heat pumps. If it's a 50-unit building and it's kind of maybe market rate or less, and you're okay with an air source heat pump out on the balcony, or if your roof has the space and you're okay with 60 condensing units on the roof, and you're on a budget, air source, because it definitely will be less expensive overall. And it's not so much the bore field, that's the mechanical distribution system. That's more of less of a geothermal conversation. It's more, are you okay with air source heat pumps, split units versus a water source heat pump or a fixed central plant and fan coil? And a lot of that is scale. if you have a 400 unit building, a central chiller plant is probably, because economies of scale, going to make more sense in the building than air source heat pumps. It's a much more practical solution. We've got projects, 70-story towers downtown where you're never going to do 100% of geo or air source. Now it's just about what's the easiest path to CMHC or TGS. One option is we can put holes in the ground that might do 30% of the peak load, 60% of the aggregate, getting the CMHC or TGS requirements, checking that box. Or you could put an 800-ton air to water heat recovery chiller on the roof. The question now is, does that roof on a tall tower have enough space for an 800-ton heat pump? And the geothermal, it's not so much a financial decision in that case. It's just the path of least resistance. It's the easiest way to get there because there just isn't space for air source. And I forget the second question, if you can remind me what that is.
It was just about the approximate lifespans and what.
Oh, lifespan, yeah. So, and that is another consideration. The air source, it's a piece of equipment that's outside and it has obviously a useful life. Maybe it's 20 years, 25, 15, I don't know. The geothermal portion, the infrastructure in the ground will be there longer than the building. It's high density polyethylene, which is basically the same material and fusion technique that Enbridge uses for natural gas lines. And those are obviously, I don't know what the expected life is, but financially they're amortized over 80 years. So it's certainly at least that. The only thing that breaks it down is UV rays, which obviously not an issue underneath the building. So essentially it's forever.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim and Mercedes. That was a very informational session.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you. Great questions.
We're going to jump into our last session for today, which is Torque and Mains, and they're going to be discussing upcoming amendments to the Construction Act.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Quinter. I am a partner and co-chair of the construction group at Torque and Mains. Torque and Mains, for those of you who don't know, is an industry-leading full-service Toronto-based law firm, and we have extensive expertise in both real estate and construction law. My practice is exclusively in the area of construction law. I'm going to speak to you briefly this morning about the upcoming changes to the Construction Act, which is a phrase I think I've been saying for 8 years now, but the government keeps making more changes, so we keep needing to talk about them. There's two changes that we're going to discuss that I think are going to be of the most significance to this crowd. First, there is a small but important change to the prompt payment rules, and the second is the mandatory annual release of holdback. As an overarching comment, I'll note, we don't know when the changes to the act are going to come into effect. They have received royal assent, and they're going to come into effect whenever the Lieutenant Governor gets around to proclaiming them in effect. So I don't know that we're going to get a lot of notice. They're just going to be in effect one day, and we don't know when it's going to be. So starting with the prompt payment changes, I know you are all diligently following the prompt payment rules, but to just give them a quick recap, the entire prompt payment regime is triggered by the delivery by the contractor of a proper invoice. And a proper invoice is not an invoice that the owner likes, it's an invoice that complies with the specific legislative requirements. The whole prompt payment regime is really the proper invoice is the linchpin of that whole regime. So as an owner, when you're given a proper invoice, you must pay the full amount of the invoice within 28 days, unless you give a notice of non-payment within 14 days. So you've got two options as an owner. If you don't give a notice of non-payment and then you don't pay, the contractor can drag you before an adjudicator, and the adjudicator will likely not give any consideration to the reasons why you haven't paid. They will just force you to pay. So that's, in a nutshell, the way that the prompt payment regime is supposed to work. Contractor delivers a proper invoice, and that gives the owner two options: either deliver a notice of non-payment or pay the full amount. If you don't pay, an adjudicator will force you to, and there is no way really to defend against that kind of adjudication. The prompt payment rules are mandatory, but I'm sure that a lot of you have experienced this on your own projects. If the contractor delivers an invoice that is not a proper invoice and the owner pays the invoice, the parties have effectively opted out of the mandatory regime. So I'm not going to speculate on how often parties may be opting out of the prompt payment regime, but I will say that the government has seen fit to introduce a mechanism to force people back into it. So under the upcoming amendments, if a contractor delivers an invoice that does not comply with the requirements of a proper invoice, an owner will have 7 days to notify the contractor that the invoice doesn't constitute a proper invoice. And if they don't give that notice, the invoice is deemed to be a proper invoice. I know you're all on mute, so I didn't hear the collective gasp that I assume you all let out, but this is a really big deal. And it's a big deal because if you don't deliver a notice of non-payment, you have no defense to not paying an invoice. So suppose that you have a contractor who sends you a really big invoice. Let's call it a few $1,000,000, and maybe it includes amounts that weren't certified. Maybe it includes unapproved change orders. Maybe it includes a delay claim. If it's not a proper invoice, the systems you might have in place to send notices of non-payment aren't triggered. Okay, so maybe you spend a few weeks internally reviewing the invoice and deciding how to respond. In doing so, you miss the 7 days to notify the contractor that the invoice isn't a proper invoice. You miss the 14 days to deliver a notice of non-payment. Well, now the Act deems that invoice to be a proper invoice. And if you don't pay it, an adjudicator is going to force you to. And that's true even if it includes unapproved changes, even if it includes, a big delay claim that they may not have any entitlement to. So the really important takeaway here is that with this upcoming change to the Act, we all need to be operating within the prompt payment rules. If you're currently operating on the edge and you have contractors who aren't delivering proper invoices and you're just paying them, you are exposing yourself to a lot of risk. Because if a contractor delivers an invoice to you and then one day decides they want to enforce their rights under the prompt payment rules, they can just do it. And if you haven't put the protections in place to ensure that you're not caught by that, you may be in a situation where you get a big invoice, you don't really realize that you're operating within the prompt payment rules, and now an adjudicator is telling you, you have to pay this invoice and you have no defense. So that's the takeaway for the new prompt payment rules. The other big important change that I want to talk about is the new mandatory annual release of holdback. Currently, as you all know, holdback for the whole project is released at the end of the project. And there are broadly 2 exceptions to that. The first is certification of a subcontract as complete. And you might do that for the early trades, or you might not. And it might be that your excavation contractor has to wait, 4 years until the project is complete to get its holdback. The other exception is the last wave of amendments to the Act provided for holdback to be released on a phased or annual basis. I haven't seen any uptake of that in my practice. I'd be surprised if many of you are permitting the phased or annual release of holdback on your projects. The upcoming amendments to the Act, which aren't in force yet, are going to provide for a mandatory annual release of holdback. And the way that's going to work is every year on the anniversary of the contract, the owner is going to be required to publish a notice of annual release of holdback. It's similar to how you would publish a notice of certification of substantial performance. And then after you publish the notice of annual release of holdback, you release all of the holdback that's been accrued up to the date of that notice. So for the first notice, it's all of the holdback from the beginning of the project up to the first year of the anniversary of the contract. And then each subsequent year, you'll release all of the holdback that was accrued in between the last annual release of holdback and the new one. When you release that holdback, you discharge all of the liens that might be claimed against that holdback. So this annual release of holdback is bringing with it a new lien period. So effectively, everyone's lien rights are going to restart every year on the anniversary of the contract. And it's early still to see how this is going to play out in practice, but what it should do is avoid seeing some of the really big liens and lots of liens that we tend to see at the end of a project. So everyone sort of waits, and then when they find out that maybe the holdback isn't going to be released, or the contractor has a whole bunch of claims that have added up and they're not being paid for things, then everyone starts to lean. This should help address issues as they come up on an annual basis, so that by the end of the project, there's only a little bit left to deal with, and you're not dealing with, tens of millions of dollars worth of liens right at the end of the project. I've spoken briefly about these because we're coming up to the end of our time. Actually, I think we're a little bit over our time, and fundamentally, from an owner's perspective, these are the most important things for you to know about the upcoming changes to the Act. I see there's some questions in the chat box, and I will answer those. But if you have any other questions, or you're looking for any support in managing the upcoming changes, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find my contact information, I believe, in the LandPRO materials or on Workington's website. I see a comment that says we've only experienced prompt payment on municipal or other government projects. That's from someone named David. If you have anything else you want to say about that, feel free to put it in the chat box. But I will address that comment by saying that's not surprising to me. I'm personally seeing that a lot of projects are operating on what I'm going to call the edge of the prompt payment regime. But fundamentally, I mentioned earlier that if you don't deliver a proper invoice, you can effectively opt out of the regime, notwithstanding that it's mandatory. That is what I'm seeing on a lot of projects. But the corollary to what I'm seeing on a lot of projects is that when things are going well and the project is just, humming along, the contractor's delivering regular invoices and the owner's paying the regular invoices and everything's going fine. Toward the end of a project, maybe delay damages start to mount on one side or both sides. Maybe there are change orders that haven't been approved. And then at some point, the contractor says, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to deliver a proper invoice, and that's going to trigger certain obligations. And maybe the owner will be caught unawares because they haven't been doing this the whole time, so they won't really notice. They won't deliver a notice of non-payment, and now I can take them before an adjudicator and force them to pay the full amount of this invoice. So I'm seeing that a lot, and I think you're right, David, that the prompt payment rules are being employed in a much more regimented manner on municipal or government projects. But I want to be clear, the prompt payment rules are mandatory on all construction projects in Ontario, and that includes construction projects of every size, including small residential builds. So they can certainly enforce their rights on any size project, whether or not you've been really properly engaging with those rules throughout. And there's another question from David about the mandatory annual release of holdback, and it's a good one. Does this have to be documented in a contract? Our experience is lenders will not release based on advice from their legal counsel. That's a really important question, and there's sort of two questions in there. I'm going to address both. With respect to whether it has to be documented in a contract, no, not under the new rules. Under the old rules, or I'll say the last wave of amendments, you could provide for the annual release of holdback in your contract under certain circumstances. No one is really doing that, and I can understand why. A lot of it has to do with, as David says, the lenders. Lenders are going to be very reticent to release holdback early based on the terms in a contract. You're going to need to make sure that your lending agreement matches the terms in your contract. So people are really staying away from the optional annual release of holdback. The new changes to the Act are going to include a mandatory annual release of holdback. And I think that lending agreements in some cases are going to need to change, because I have seen lending agreements that specifically say the circumstances under which holdback will be released, and they're intended to match the Act, but they'll say on substantial performance or certification of a subcontract complete. And under the current version of the Act, those are the circumstances in which holdback can be released. But I think what we're going to see is these changes are going to come into effect. They're going to apply to projects that are currently underway, but the lending agreement isn't going to provide for the annual release of holdback, notwithstanding that it is actually mandatory for the owner under the new legislation. So One thing to consider when you're getting into new lending agreements is actually making sure that the language in the lending agreement tracks all the potential language under the act for when holdback might be released and isn't tied to the specific conditions under this version of the legislation. Because I think we're about to get into a situation in which the legislation doesn't match the language in a lot of lending agreements, and it's going to be a little bit chaotic for a little while.
Amazing, Kayla. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So everyone, I will have everybody's contact information, especially when I upload the video. So if you have any specific questions, you can just shoot them to me for now and I will pass them on to everybody. I'll also have everyone's contact information so you can contact them directly. I will have this uploaded and edited probably later today on our YouTube, and I will also send it out to everybody so they have a copy. Again, thank you everybody for coming, and that is the end of our webinar. Thanks, everybody.